Imagine a man who thought he had the perfect life until one fateful night shatters everything. What happens when the truth catches up to him, and it's more terrifying than any lie he's told. Stay tuned, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, guilt, and redemption. This is the shocking story of Jason Clay, a man who thought he could get away with murder until the past came back to haunt him. Don't miss the twist that will leave you speechless. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air was thick. A heavy mist clung to everything. A faint smell of damp earth lingered. The streets were silent. Too silent. Allison Clay was gone. Her husband, Jason, had called it in. She was missing. She hadn't come home the night before. He sounded frantic, but not completely frantic. His voice was too calm, too controlled. The officers had searched the neighborhood. Nothing. Jason said he'd been out looking for her all night, but no one had seen her. Allison's car was still in the driveway, her phone on the kitchen counter. Jason insisted she'd just wandered off. They found nothing to suggest foul play. No broken windows. No forced doors. Her purse was on the bedroom floor. The whole house felt wrong. The investigation stalled. Days passed. Jason said she'd been acting strangely before her disappearance. He mentioned stress, but that was all. The case grew cold. Then, 10 days later, a call came in. A body had been found in a small park. The authorities had identified her. It was Allison. The news hit Jason like a punch. His face went pale. His eyes widened, but only for a moment. He had to be shocked, right? But there was something about his calmness that didn't sit right. His composure was unnerving. Too perfect. The body was found in a shallow grave. Her clothes were torn, as if she had fought someone. But it wasn't the wounds that made it chilling. It was the way she was found. Face down. Her body hidden almost deliberately, as if someone wanted to make a statement. Her hands were bound. A piece of cloth stuffed in her mouth. It felt personal. Too personal. The police began to piece things together. Jason wasn't as helpful as they thought he'd be. There were inconsistencies in his story. Tiny details that didn't add up. The way he described her disappearance didn't match the evidence. A tiny crack in his story. But there was more. The autopsy showed something disturbing. A single stab wound. Deep. Fatal. But there was something even darker. The wound was clean. No sign of struggle. It was almost too precise. Jason couldn't hide his discomfort anymore. The crack started to show. His calmness slipped. His guilt was starting to seep through. But the detectives didn't have enough. Not yet. They needed more. A confession. The truth. Then came the moment. The moment when Jason broke. And everything changed. The case of Allison Clay wasn't just tragic. It was horrifying. Jason sat in the interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed above. Cold. Clinical. His eyes were fixed on the table. His hands were clasped tightly, as if holding on to something. The detectives had left him alone. They wanted him to feel the weight of silence. They wanted him to break. Minutes passed. The door creaked open. Detective Harris walked in, calm. Too calm. Jason didn't look up. His lips trembled. "I need you to tell me what happened," Harris said softly. Jason didn't respond. The detective leaned in closer. His voice dropped. "We found her, Jason. You know that, right?" Jason's breath caught in his throat. His face went pale, like he could hardly believe it. But there was something else in his eyes. Something shifting. "Where were you that night?" Harris pressed. Jason's hands clenched into fists. He looked up. Finally, their eyes met. "I told you," Jason whispered. "I didn't know where she went. I couldn't find her." His voice faltered but held steady. Harris sighed. "Jason," he began slowly, "we know that's not the truth. We found the wound on her body." Jason flinched. "That wound," Harris continued, "it wasn't from a random attack. It was planned. Precise." Jason's eyes darted to the door. then back to Harris. Why would I do that? Jason asked, his voice cracking, almost pleading. Harris paused. I don't know, he answered softly. But I'm going to find out. Jason's body tensed. A long, pregnant silence filled the room. Jason closed his eyes. And then, the words spilled out. I didn't mean to, Jason whispered, his voice breaking. The confession wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was enough. The truth had escaped him. He had killed her. He had killed Allison.
But why?
That's what the detectives needed to know next. Jason's voice quivered as he began to explain. It wasn't a moment of rage. It wasn't a crime of passion.
No.
It had been planned, and it had been building for a long time. The weight of his guilt was finally too much to bear. He had thought he could live with it, but the truth had its own way of rising to the surface. And now there was no escaping it. The case of Allison Clay was no longer about a missing wife. It was about a betrayal so deep, it could never be undone. Her death, it was just the beginning. Jason's eyes glazed over as he spoke. His voice trembled, but he couldn't stop. I didn't love her anymore, he whispered, barely audible. The words were like poison. I thought I did, once. But over time, he trailed off, as if trying to make sense of his own feelings. Detective Harris leaned in, listening intently. Jason's hands shook as he continued, the weight of his own confession sinking in. She had changed. I had changed. His voice cracked, and he paused to steady himself. But I couldn't leave her. I didn't know how. Not after all we'd been through. The air in the room felt suffocating. Jason's confession was slow, deliberate, like a man coming to terms with the reality of his actions. I thought it would be easier if she was just gone. The words hung heavy in the air. Gone, Harris repeated, almost in disbelief. That's your answer? Jason nodded slowly. I thought I could live without her, he said, almost to himself. But when I did it, His eyes welled with tears, but they never fell. He wiped his face with his sleeve. I thought I could get away with it. Jason's voice grew softer, almost too quiet to hear. I never meant for it to go that far. He lowered his head, staring at the floor. I thought I could make it look like she just ran away. Like she left on her own. Harris stood still, digesting every word. But Jason wasn't finished. It was supposed to be quick. I planned it for weeks. Jason's voice was now barely more than a whisper. He closed his eyes again, reliving the night. We fought. She was angry. We always fought. But that night it was different. His hands trembled as he spoke. I grabbed the knife, and she didn't see it coming. His voice cracked as he spoke the last words. I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted it to stop. The room fell into an eerie silence. Jason sat there, broken, lost in the horror of what he had done. But there was no going back. He had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. And now, the truth was all that remained. Jason sat still, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his confession had physically crushed him. Detective Harris didn't speak. He just let the silence stretch out, heavy and thick. Jason's breaths were shallow, as if he couldn't quite gather enough air into his lungs. His hands were trembling in his lap, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes remained downcast, lost in the dark corners of his mind. The room felt colder now, as if the walls were closing in. I didn't know what to do after, Jason muttered, his voice distant. I panicked. I didn't want anyone to know. I thought if I made it look like she ran away, maybe no one would ever find out. He let out a slow, shaky breath, his lips pressed tightly together as if he couldn't speak the rest of the words. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had done. The detective's gaze never left him. Jason's confession was not just a spill of words, it was a slow unraveling of everything that had once been hidden. His face was pale, his lips tight as though he were holding back tears, but they never came. The body, Harris said, breaking the silence. It was found 10 days later. You didn't expect it to take that long, did you? Jason shook his head.
I thought she'd be found by then.
That I'd be free. But you weren't free, were you? Harris pressed, his voice steady now. No, Jason whispered. I wasn't. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes wide but unfocused. I thought if I just erased her, everything would go back to normal. But nothing's normal now. Jason's voice broke then, a sharp, guttural sound escaping him, but he didn't cry. His eyes remained dry, almost empty. Harris stood up, pacing slowly in front of the table, watching Jason like a predator studying its prey. You thought you could erase her, Harris said softly. But you didn't. Did you? Jason's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. No, he replied, his voice trembling, barely audible. I didn't. The finality of his own words seemed to settle in. Jason had made his choice that night, and now there was no turning back. The man who had once walked free, lived his life as a husband and a father, was now bound to the very thing he had tried to escape. Allison Clay's death was no longer just a crime of passion. It was a cruel, calculated act of a man who thought he could outrun his own guilt. And now, that guilt had come for him. There would be no peace for Jason.
Not now.
Not ever. The door to the interrogation room closed with a quiet thud. And outside, the world continued on. Unaware. Unchanged. But for Jason, there would be no going back. Jason sat motionless, his face drained of all color, as if the very air around him had become thick with the weight of his own actions. His eyes followed the faint shadow of Detective Harris as he walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The silence in the room was suffocating. Jason's mind was spinning, but his body remained still, like a man trapped in a nightmare with no way to wake up. His thoughts circled back to that night, the night that had started so innocently, so full of false promises, and had ended in horror. He could still see her face, that expression of shock and disbelief as she looked up at him, unable to comprehend what was happening. He could still feel the cold steel of the knife in his hands, so unfamiliar and so final. Every detail, every moment played in his mind like a reel of film on repeat, each frame filled with more dread than the last. And yet, in that moment, he couldn't escape it. He had done this. He had made this choice. The weight of her body had felt unreal when he had moved her. How could something so wrong feel so final? How could something so terrible feel so irreversible? And then there had been the days that followed. The weeks where he had lived in the lie, pretending to search for her, pretending to care. His own guilt, heavy as a stone, pressed against his chest, suffocating him. But he had somehow convinced himself that he could keep the truth buried. But the truth had a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deep you buried it. Jason's hands trembled again, and he looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else. He had tried to cover up his crime, to bury it beneath layers of lies. But it hadn't worked. The evidence was there. The body was found. The truth couldn't be erased. But still, a small part of him couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. He had killed his wife, his partner, the mother of his children, and he had thought he could live with it. But now that truth was here, unyielding and brutal, Jason's heart began to race again as the door to the room opened, and a new figure entered. It was Officer Simmons, a younger officer with a serious face, but he didn't speak. He only looked at Jason, waiting. Jason felt a pit form in his stomach, a tightening knot that refused to loosen. This was it. The last moment of freedom before the consequences of his actions would come crashing down. Jason Clay, Simmons said, his voice quiet, "You are under arrest for the murder of Allison Clay." Jason's body tensed. His breath caught in his throat. The words hit him like a physical blow, and he could barely comprehend them at first. The arrest. The handcuffs. The truth that he couldn't run from anymore. But somehow, in the deepest part of him, he knew this moment was inevitable. He had spent 10 days hoping for an escape. 10 days of lies. And now it was over. There was no running anymore. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around Jason's wrists, sending a sharp chill through his body. His heart thudded in his chest, a violent, erratic beat that seemed to echo through his entire body. Officer Simmons didn't say another word as he led Jason out of the interrogation room. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting harsh shadows along the sterile hallway. Jason's steps were slow, like a man walking in a daze, detached from the reality unfolding around him. His mind was numb. He couldn't quite process the events of the past hour. The confession. The arrest. All of it felt distant, like he was watching someone else's life unravel. They reached the exit, and the chill of the outside air hit him as the doors swung open. The officers guided him to the waiting patrol car. Jason barely noticed the reporters gathered outside, cameras flashing in his direction, their questions cutting through the air, but not reaching him. The lights from the cameras flashed like a storm, blinding in their intensity. But Jason was numb. His mind kept replaying the moments before it all came crashing down. The sharp flash of steel. The cold expression on Allison's face as she realized what was happening. The final, sickening feeling when he had taken her life. And the crushing guilt that had followed, which now seemed to be tearing him apart from the inside out. As he was pushed into the back seat of the patrol car, Jason could hear the faint hum of the engine as it roared to life. But the world outside felt far away. It was as though he was drifting further from reality, detached from everything that had once been his life. He thought of the children. His children. He thought of the life he had stolen from them. The innocence that would never return. What would they think of him? How could he ever face them again? His thoughts were a blur, clouded by the weight of what he had done. But one thought stood out, persistent and unyielding. Allison was gone, and nothing would ever bring her back. The car rolled down the street, the flashing lights casting long shadows in the darkness. Jason's eyes stared blankly ahead, his mind racing. His future, his past had all collided in that one moment. The moment that had cost him everything. And as the car turned the corner, heading toward the station, Jason felt the overwhelming presence of finality. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The man who had once been Jason Clay was no more. And in his place stood a murderer. A man who had betrayed everything he once held dear. A man who would now face the consequences of his actions. The car stopped outside the precinct, the engine's hum slowly fading into the night. The door opened, and Jason was pulled out, his feet unsteady as if he were walking on unfamiliar ground. The cold air wrapped around him, biting at his skin, but he barely felt it. His entire body felt numb. They led him through the front door, past the officers who gave him knowing glances, some with pity, some with disgust. Jason couldn't meet their eyes. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes. His mind was trapped in a haze of guilt, spinning like a whirlwind, each thought faster than the last. He had taken her life, and now he was paying the price. He was guided into a small holding cell, the heavy door clanging shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver through his spine. The sound echoed in his ears, louder than it should have been. But there was nothing he could do to escape it. The walls around him seemed to close in. The room was dimly lit, the flickering light overhead casting an eerie glow across the concrete floor. The smell of metal and dampness clung to the air, and the distant sound of another door slamming in the hallway made him flinch. Jason sat on the edge of the cold metal bench, his hands resting in his lap, his eyes unfocused. The weight of everything was crushing him. Allison was gone. His life was over. But as the minutes stretched on, something began to settle deep within him, a slow realization. The truth was unbearable, but it was the truth. He had murdered her, and now he would face the consequences. There was no escaping it. For the first time since that night, Jason allowed himself to feel it. The cold, sharp sting of regret, the suffocating tightness in his chest. He had been running for so long, hiding behind his lies, trying to make it seem like he was still in control. But now, there was nothing left. No more lies. No more pretending. And yet, despite the crushing weight of everything, there was something else stirring beneath it all. A strange kind of clarity. He would pay for what he had done. The guilt was inescapable. But somewhere deep inside, Jason realized that, in a way, he deserved it. A soft click echoed through the cell, and Jason looked up. It was a guard, holding a small tray of food, but Jason didn't care. He didn't have an appetite. He didn't have the strength to care. The guard set the tray down without a word, then walked out, leaving Jason alone again. He barely looked at the food, his mind too far gone. His life was over, and nothing could bring it back. The door to the cell remained locked. Jason Clay was no longer free. And with that final thought, he sank into the cold bench, his head resting against the wall, eyes staring into the dim light above. There was nothing left to do but wait and face whatever came next. The hours dragged on, and the stillness of the cell grew heavier with each passing minute. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that time had stopped. The only sounds were the distant echoes of footsteps in the hallway and the occasional creak of the building settling. But it all felt so distant. His thoughts circled, each one a reminder of what he had done, each one a fresh stab of guilt. He tried to close his eyes, to escape, but it was impossible. The images of that night, of the blood, the struggle, Allison's face, kept haunting him, flashing behind his eyelids every time he tried to rest. He had killed her. The realization cut deeper than anything he had ever felt before. He had never imagined it would come to this. He had never imagined he'd be sitting here, in this cold, dark cell, facing the consequences of his actions. His hands twitched. The handcuffs that had once felt like a mere formality were now a constant, uncomfortable reminder of his crime. Jason's mind flickered to his children. What would they think? How could he ever look them in the eyes again? He had been their father, their protector. And now he was nothing more than a murderer. The door to the cell opened, the harsh light from the hallway spilling in, blinding him for a moment. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the light. It was Detective Harris. Jason looked up, his gaze empty, his expression hollow. Harris stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit. He just stood there, his eyes locked on Jason's face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Harris broke the silence. "You know why you're here," he said, his voice low and steady. "But you don't have to face this alone." Jason blinked, as if the words didn't quite reach him at first. "I didn't," his voice broke, but he couldn't finish the thought. "I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to hurt her." Harris looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said quietly. "But that doesn't change what happened, does it?" Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It doesn't." Another heavy silence filled the room, and Jason could feel the weight of Harris's gaze on him. The detective didn't move, didn't offer comfort. He didn't need to. Jason had already condemned himself. The truth was all that mattered now. "I don't expect you to forgive yourself," Harris continued, his tone softer. "But you're going to have to face what you did. No one else can do that for you." Jason's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white as the reality of the situation hit him again. There was no going back. No way to undo what had been done. Allison was gone. And Jason's life, as he knew it, was over. Harris took a step back, but before he turned to leave, he glanced back one last time. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice almost sympathetic. "But this is just the beginning for you." The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, leaving Jason alone again. Alone with his thoughts. Alone with the truth. And in that moment, Jason realized something he hadn't wanted to admit until now. There was no escape. Not from his guilt, not from the consequences. He had destroyed everything. And now, there was nothing left but the long road ahead, filled with judgment and pain. A road that led to the only place he could go. The rest of his life. Jason sat there, the room growing colder as the minutes stretched on. The harsh fluorescent light above buzzed, casting its sickly glow over everything. The walls seemed to close in further, as if they too were suffocating him. But it wasn't the walls that were pressing down on him. It was his own mind. The endless replay of that night. The look on Allison's face as she realized the end was near. The sound of a knife cutting through the air. The final breath she had taken before her life was extinguished. Jason rubbed his face with his hands, trying to erase the images, but they lingered, burned into his mind like a scar. He thought back to the days before it all happened, to the small moments that had led him to that breaking point. The quiet frustrations, the growing distance between him and Allison. The arguments, the silences, the slowly eroding connection. But none of it had ever seemed like it would come to this. And yet here he was, a murderer. The words felt foreign on his lips, but they were the undeniable truth. Jason had killed his wife. There was no justification, no excuse. He had done it. He had taken her life, and in doing so, he had destroyed everything he had once known. His family, his future, his freedom, all gone. The realization hit him harder than any blow could have. His chest tightened, his breath shallow. The panic was rising again, that suffocating feeling that there was no way out, no way to undo what he had done. Suddenly, the door to the cell opened again, and Jason looked up, his heart racing in his chest. This time, it was a different officer. A younger one, carrying a clipboard. "Jason Clay?" the officer asked, his voice flat. Jason nodded, his throat dry, his mind still spinning with the weight of his guilt. "It's time for your arraignment," the officer said. "Come with me." Jason stood slowly, his legs unsteady, like he wasn't quite sure how to move anymore. The officer cuffed him again, more gently this time, as if he could sense the defeat radiating from Jason. The hallway outside was quieter now, the bustle of earlier replaced by an eerie calm. Jason's mind was a blur as they walked through the building, the cold concrete floors echoing beneath his feet. The weight of his own footsteps seemed to grow louder with each step, each one carrying him closer to a reality he couldn't escape. They reached the courtroom, and Jason was led inside. The judge, an older man with a stern expression, looked down at him as he entered, his gavel resting lightly in his hand. Jason's heart was pounding in his chest. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, his face, his every movement, scrutinized, judged. He stood there, trying to steady himself, but it was impossible. Everything was falling apart. "Mr. Clay," the judge said, his voice cold and dispassionate. "You are charged with the murder of your wife, Allison Clay. How do you plead?" Jason didn't answer immediately. His thoughts raced, but his mouth felt dry. He opened it, but no words came. The weight of the question hung in the air, suffocating him, and finally, when he couldn't hold it in any longer, he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Guilty." The room seemed to go silent for a moment, as if the very air had stopped moving. The judge nodded solemnly, his gavel coming down with a sharp, final thud. "Guilty," he repeated. Jason's chest tightened again. The truth was out there now. There was no more pretending, no more lying. The weight of his actions was now a permanent part of him. And as he was led away, the gavel's echo still ringing in his ears, Jason realized that, in the end, there was no escaping what he had done. The truth had come for him, and now, there was nothing left but the consequences. Jason's feet moved automatically, one step following the other, but it all felt distant, as though he was watching himself from somewhere far away. The weight of the handcuffs around his wrists was the only thing grounding him in reality, a constant reminder of the irreversible truth he had faced. The courtroom was silent now, save for the shuffle of papers and the soft murmur of voices outside. The moment of judgment was over, and the echo of the gavel's strike still reverberated in his mind.
Guilty.
It wasn't just a word. It was a verdict, a sentence, a permanent mark that Jason could never erase. As he was led back down the hallway, the sterile environment seemed even more suffocating than before. The walls, the ceiling, the harsh, fluorescent lights, they all felt like they were closing in on him. Each step felt heavier, like his body was carrying an unbearable weight. And in his mind, the reality of his situation began to settle like a cold stone. His life, as he had known it, was gone. There was no going back to the family he had once had, no returning to the life that had slipped so easily from his grasp. The future he had imagined was a distant, unreachable thing. And what would come next? He didn't know. But he knew there was no escaping the consequences of what he had done. Back in the holding cell, the hours seemed to stretch endlessly. Jason's mind was a blur of regret, pain, and confusion. He couldn't think of anything except the weight of his own guilt, the weight of Allison's absence. The pain of knowing that he had taken her life, had taken everything from her, from their children, was like a constant ache that gnawed at him. He had thought he could bury the truth, that he could erase what he had done, but the truth had found him. And now it was impossible to ignore. The door to the cell opened again, and this time, it was a familiar face. Detective Harris stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Jason barely looked up. He was too exhausted, too numb to care. Harris stepped inside, and Jason felt the weight of his gaze on him, steady and unflinching. "You made your plea," Harris said softly, breaking the silence. "You know what's coming next." Jason nodded slowly, his throat tight. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse. "I don't know how to live with this," he whispered. "I don't know how to face what I've done." Harris didn't answer immediately. He just stood there for a moment, watching Jason with a quiet intensity. "There's no easy way out of this," he finally said. "You can't undo what's been done. But you can face it. You have to." Jason looked up then, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "I don't think I can." Harris gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That's the hardest part. But you have to live with it now. You have to face the truth every single day. There's no running from it anymore." Jason closed his eyes, swallowing hard, as if he could somehow push the truth away. But it wouldn't leave him. It was a part of him now, a scar that would never fade. The silence between them stretched, and Jason felt an overwhelming wave of despair wash over him. What had he become? The man he had once been, loving husband, father, provider, was gone. In his place stood a man who had destroyed everything he had once held dear. And in the quiet, cold cell, Jason knew that his sentence had already begun. Not just the one handed down by the court, but the one that had started the moment he took her life. It was a life sentence. And he would serve it alone. Days passed slowly for Jason. The days inside the cold, gray walls of the jail blurred into one long, suffocating stretch. His mind, though numb, refused to let him forget. There were no more distractions, no more pretending. The truth had him trapped, and it would never let him go. He spent most of his days staring at the bare walls of his cell, the occasional voice or footstep echoing down the hall. The quiet was overwhelming, like a physical force pressing in on him, filling the space until there was no room left for anything else. He thought about his children, the faces of his little ones, innocent and unaware of the darkness that had taken over their lives. He thought about the way Allison used to smile at him, the way she laughed, the way they had once shared dreams of the future. But all of that had been shattered. All of it was gone. Jason was left with nothing but the cold, unyielding truth. He had killed her. and no amount of remorse could ever bring her back. One afternoon, a guard entered his cell, breaking the endless silence. Jason didn't look up. He had long since stopped expecting visitors. His life had been reduced to this small, unremarkable space, and he didn't deserve anything more. "You've got a visitor," the guard said. Jason's heart skipped a beat. A visitor? His mind flashed to his children. Could it be one of them? His mother? But when the guard opened the door, Jason was surprised to see Detective Harris again. The detective's face was as stern as ever, but there was something different in his eyes now. A kind of knowing, like he had seen Jason for what he truly was. "I'm not here to talk about the case," Harris said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm here to remind you that there's still a chance for you, Jason. You still have a choice." Jason's eyes met Harris's, and for the first time in days, something flickered inside him. A tiny spark of hope. Harris stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You have a chance to do something with what's left of your life. Don't waste it." Jason swallowed, his throat tight, unsure of how to respond. The words felt impossible, but as he sat there, facing the man who had seen him at his lowest, something inside him stirred. Maybe it was too late to undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to face the future. There would never be forgiveness. There would never be redemption. But perhaps there was something else. A way to make amends, even if it was just for himself. Harris gave him one last look, a look that seemed to say everything Jason didn't have the strength to say. Then, without another word, he turned and left, the heavy door of the cell closing behind him. Jason sat there, alone again, but for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of his guilt wasn't the only thing on his shoulders. Something else lingered in the silence. A faint glimmer of possibility. A chance to find something in the ruins of everything he had lost. The days that followed felt different to Jason. Not easier, but different. The weight of guilt still clung to him, suffocating, relentless. But Harris's words had planted something inside him, a seed that, though small, refused to die. Jason spent the following weeks in silence, his thoughts churning, but slowly. The haze of despair began to lift. Each morning, as he woke to the sterile, gray walls of his cell, he allowed himself a moment of clarity. He would never escape the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could face the future. The truth, brutal and unyielding, was a part of him now. But that truth didn't have to define him completely. Not anymore. There were no easy answers, no way to undo the damage he had caused. He couldn't bring Allison back. He couldn't fix what he had broken. But in his quiet moments, he realized something else. He could still change. Jason began to read. At first, it was only small distractions, a book, a magazine, anything to break the monotony. But as the days went by, he started to read with purpose. The books gave him space to think, to process, to understand the things he had never paid attention to before. And then, one day, the prison chaplain came to visit him. Jason had never been a religious man, but the chaplain spoke to him not about salvation, but about redemption. "It's not about erasing the past," the chaplain had said. "It's about living with it. It's about choosing to be a better man, even in the face of what you've done." For the first time in a long while, Jason felt something stir within him. A desire to try. To make something of the wreckage of his life. It was a small thing, a whisper of hope, fragile and tentative. But it was there. Jason knew the road ahead would be long. There would be no easy path, no forgiveness from the world or from the people he had wronged. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could learn to forgive himself. And in that quiet cell, with the sound of his own breath filling the emptiness, Jason Clay made a choice. He would face the consequences of his actions. And in doing so, he would try to live the remainder of his life with the only thing left to him, his conscience. The past could never be undone, but the future, with all its uncertainty, was his to shape. And with that thought, Jason closed his eyes and allowed himself a rare, fragile moment of peace. The journey had begun, not to redemption, but to acceptance. And that, he realized, was enough.